Have you ever dreamed of capturing breathtaking panoramic or very wide photos, but felt overwhelmed when you picked up your camera and you attempted to take the shot? Well, you're not alone. I've been there as well. As an amateur photographer still finding my way, I've learned some great tips for creating stunning panorama photos, and I'm excited to share them with you in this video. And stay tuned, because at the end, I've got a bonus tip that reveals a tactic that the pros always implement and that the amateurs often forget. So before we get into the how, let's look at the why. Now, you might be sat there wondering, why should I even care about panorama photography? Well, think about those times that you've experienced in real life a breathtaking landscape. The types of landscapes that make you feel tiny when you stand there in comparison to them. Often, one of the reasons why they look so epic is because they are bigger and wider than what you can fully grasp with your peripheral vision alone. These landscapes require you to look around to take things in. So, with a panorama shot, if you can give the viewer a shot wide enough that it fills their peripheral vision, you can create the same feeling in them as well. Now, sure, you could crop a wide-angle photo and get a quote-unquote panoramic shot, but there are two issues to this. First off, you're going to face the wide-angle distortion and probably some vignetting, because you're going to be using a wide-angle lens to get the width that you need for this shot that you're going to crop. And by the very nature of cropping a single photo, you're going to lose a ton of megapixels out of the top and the bottom of the frame. Now, most of the time, the best way to capture panoramic shots is to take multiple frames and then stitch them back together using software like Lightroom when you go home and you edit your shots later on. And here is the kicker. Panoramic photography is actually pretty simple. You don't need fancy gear to get started shooting panoramas. Heck, to get half decent results right now, you might not need any new gear at all. I've shot some of my favorite panoramas by hand with my regular old camera with a not so sharp Tamron lens and a little bit of patience. And of course, there is specialized equipment out there, but for most amateur photographers, I'm not sure that you really need it. All right, okay, confession time. When I first started shooting panoramas, I thought that I needed to buy all kinds of special equipment. You know, all those fancy panoramic and nodal heads that cost more money than my actual first camera and lens cost together. But here's the thing, you don't always need them. Let me explain what they are, and then you can make that decision for yourself, right? So first up, what the heck is a panoramic head? Well, a panoramic head is a tripod head that you stick your camera on top of, and it has one main function and one main function alone. It turns the camera around 360 degrees to make it easier to turn the camera when you're taking the shots that you're going to stack up and stitch together in Lightroom later on. The benefit of using a panoramic head primarily is that if you have a ball head on top of your tripod, every time that you loosen it to adjust the shot and then loosen it to adjust the shot, you're never going to retighten the head with a camera in a straight line to get a straight stack of images. Each one of your shots is just not going to be aligned with the next. However, the reality is that the stitching software that's available in tools like Lightroom is so good that as long as your images are overlapping, most of the time, 99 times out of 100, it's going to find a way to stitch them together. Then we have what are called nodal heads, and these are a little bit more specialized. A nodal head allows you to reposition the point at which the camera rotates when you're taking a panoramic shot. This reduces what's called the parallax effect when taking your photos, when you later try and stitch them all together into a single photograph. And if that sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, let me explain visually. So let's say I take 3 shots with the camera attached to my tripod in the usual spots, the usual tripod hole on the bottom of the camera body. And I rotate my camera around 20 degrees after each shot, and I've got a foreground in the shot. The end result might look like this. Now, obviously, Lightroom is going to really struggle to stitch these photos together. And without getting into the science behind nodal heads, the nodal point, the non-parallax point, and the pupil entrance, there is a somewhat simple way to fix this problem. You can use what's called a nodal head to move the camera and lens backwards slightly so that the rotation of the camera and the lens occurs around a point at which this parallax effect essentially has no effectively noticeable difference in the end results. However, for most of the people watching the Photography Explained content, making perhaps panoramic landscape photos, you don't really need to worry about any of this. Unless your panorama has a foreground pretty close to the front of your camera lens, 5, 10, maybe 15 foot away, then the parallax effect is not going to be noticeable if you're using a standard tripod head or if you're doing these shots by hand. Now, the pros out there might disagree with me, But I think it's better to start simple here. Get comfortable with the basics before you start spending money on gear that you're probably going to use once and then you're never going to use again. Trust me, your wallet's going to thank you for it. Now, before I set up, no matter if I'm going to be taking the panoramic photo handheld or using my tripod, I like to get my phone out and I like to see how my vision of the shot as I look at the scene actually looks on a screen. On my phone screen. I use the app XP4N, which gives a pleasing 65 by 24 or X-Pan aspect ratio to frame up my shot. And only once I'm happy that I've got a photo that something might be interesting, if I take all the time to get this set up, stitch it all together, and then edit the result. Once I'm happy that I might have a photo here, that's when I grab my camera. So, rapid fire. I shoot in manual mode because I want a consistency with each and every photo. Every photo's got to have the same exposure if they're going to stitch together effectively in post-production. Then number 2, I make sure that auto ISO is turned off, again to make sure that each one of my shots are consistent. I set my aperture to f11 or even higher to make sure that I've got lots of depth of field in my shot. I set my ISO as low as it can go and I set my shutter speed so that it's balanced with my ISO. So it lets in enough light that I'm not getting a grainy high ISO image, but the shutter speed isn't open so long that I introduce lots of movement into my shots if it's windy. Again, that will affect the stitching process later on. Now, your choice of focal length is important too. Too wide and you're going to get distortion at the edge of your frames and that's going to make the stitching difficult. Too long and you're going to have to take a gazillion photos to capture your scene. For me personally, something between 35mm and 70mm is my usual choice. And that then is the camera setup and we're almost ready to go. If you're shooting your panorama by hand, then fire away, get those shots. Make sure to get at least a 1/3 of your frame overlapped with the next frame as you go across to get your panorama so that Lightroom has enough data to stitch it all together when you get home. And for a lot of people watching this video, that might be all you need to create epic panoramic photos. Now, I do like to use my tripod, and if you're shooting a panoramic shot on a tripod, there's a few more steps to getting set up. First off, make sure that your tripod is set up and leveled. I personally use a leveling base at the top of my tripod as, well, quite frankly, I'm too lazy to level each one of the legs every single time I set up my tripod, and I want the top of it to essentially be flat. The leveling base essentially allows you to quickly make sure that the top of your tripod, before you stick your head on it, is level. I also use an L bracket on my camera body so that I can mount it directly on top of the camera when I'm taking vertical shots rather than having it on a ball head on the side, because that can introduce parallax issues. And then make sure that the level display on the back of the camera is somewhat decently level. I mean, I don't find that they're all that accurate in reality, but I get it somewhat decent level, and then I start shooting my shots to grab my panorama. And finally, and I find this really useful, it sounds crazy and stupid and dead simple, I find this really useful. At the end of each one of my rows of panoramic shots, I like to take a picture of my hand in front of the camera. Why? Well, it's not because I'm crazy. It's so that when I jump into Lightroom, I can then see this panoramic range of shots and then a big, ugly, blurry picture of my hand. I know when the chain of shots starts and finishes, and so it makes my editing process a lot easier and there's a lot less faffing around trying to suss out where the shot finishes, starts, and everything in between. And we've covered a lot of ground in today's video, but I promised you a bonus tip, didn't I? And here it is. This is a lesson that I learned the hard way, and it's one that I wish someone had told me when I first started out in photography. Always take what's called a safe shot before you start your panorama. And what do I mean by that? A safe shot is a single frame that captures essentially the essence of your scene. Think of it as your insurance policy, because the thing about panoramas is they don't always work out. Sometimes the light changes as you're getting set up and you start taking your shots. Sometimes there's too much movement in the scene and you can't stitch them together. Sometimes, it's rare to be honest, but sometimes Lightroom just does not want to stitch your shots together. And if you're faffing about getting set up and taking your panorama shot and you miss it, you're going to be gutted that you didn't get the safe shot first. Even though you might be missing a few megapixels, maybe you'd used a wide angle lens and a bit of distortion, it doesn't matter. It's going to be much better than having nothing at all. And so when I'm doing panoramic photography, this has become a ritual for me. I get my phone out, I find the shot using that app I mentioned at the top of the video, I then use a wide angle lens to get that safety shot, and then once I've got that hopefully somewhat well composed single image, it's only then that I start thinking about the more formal high megapixel stitched Panorama. And this approach, especially in landscape photography, and I like doing landscape photography with changing weather conditions, this has saved my bacon a bunch of times at this point. And I've got one final, people are not going to like this. This is the kind of point that just gets me a bunch of abuse in the comments below this video, and that is fine. But if you've got a nice shot and you didn't do a panorama in the field and you wanted it to be a panorama in hindsight, looking back at it, in all honesty, the generative fill tool in Photoshop is truly phenomenal. If all you're trying to do is make your shot a little bit wider and you're not entering your photography into a photography competition, or you're not lying on the internet about how you created your photos, generative AI is incredible. Every single time that I try it, it absolutely blows my mind as to how lifelike it really is. And speaking of photography competitions, do you want to win $10,000? Well, that's exactly what I'm offering with the Photography Explained Awards. A $10,000 cash prize, winner takes all, transparent judging, and a maximum of 1,000 photographers can enter to increase your chances of winning. Click the link in the description or head over to photographyexplained.com/awards to learn more. And if you want to dive deeper into improving your photography skills, why not click the video that's on the screen right now.